The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 14th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. So today, the story continues. We continue our journey with Jesus, and as what we hear begins with immediately, we know that something has happened just before this. Now, if you've been reading along during the week and preparing for worship by doing that, you would know that what happened immediately before this is what we left off with last week, that Jesus has just fed 5,000 men besides women and children. And immediately, Jesus invites his disciples. No, he tells his disciples, "Get in the boat, go on over to the other side. I'll catch up with you. I'll dismiss the crowd." And after he dismisses the crowd, after they all take off and he is alone, he goes up on the mountain to pray. Now, you may remember this is why he came to this place in the first place. He came to this place so that he could have time alone. Because he had heard that John the Baptizer had been executed, had been beheaded. Presumably, Jesus wanted and needed some time to grieve. But more than that, we also know, if we back up even farther in the story, that Jesus has just come from his hometown. And things didn't go particularly well there. Remember, they were all remembering that he was the son of the carpenter. And they got a little upset with him because he seemed to be teaching with authority that they weren't so sure he ought to be commanding. His hometown crowd became offended with him. So it's quite possible that as he went up on that mountaintop to pray, that he went up to talk to his Father in heaven, that part of what he wanted to talk about was this thing with John. But it may have been that he also needed to reflect on what had happened in his hometown and what comes next. And as evening approached, and indeed as it moved on into the, well, it said evening, but the reality is that it's quite probable that by the time he headed out to see his disciples, to catch up with them, it was close to 3 o'clock in the morning. And the disciples were still out on the sea because the wind had been against them, and they were still a long way from the shore. And Jesus starts to come to them. Now, this is the point where we need to make sure that we are reading Matthew's gospel and not one of the other stories like this. Because the interesting thing about the way that Matthew tells this story, the disciples don't seem to be all that upset by the storm. Maybe a little bewildered that it's taken them all night to cross the sea. It ought to take that long. But the truth of the matter is, as one of my colleagues points out, that people in the Middle East know that those kinds of storms, those kinds of winds come up all the time. It's not unusual. And so if you listen carefully, the disciples aren't frightened by the storm. But when they see this figure coming across the water at them, that's not to be expected. That's not normal. They don't know how to interpret it. And so they go to the first place that they can think of. It's a ghost. And they're terrified, frightened. And then we have that whole thing with Jesus calling out to them and Peter and that part of the story. I'm not sure I want to spend a lot of time with that part of the story. I want to pay attention to a question that started to emerge through this past week. And that question goes something like this. What frightens us when Jesus is coming to us to be with us? Or to put a little finer point on it, what frightens you when you know that Jesus is coming to you to be with you? You think about that just a little bit. And once you come up with that answer, and it's quite possible that that first answer that comes into your head you don't like very much and you're trying to scramble for another answer, right? I don't like that one. I'm gonna fish deeper, right? You may want to hang on to that first answer. Yesterday, I started sending text messages out to a few people. Those of you who didn't get one, you might consider yourself lucky. I asked that question. What is it about Jesus coming to you that frightens you? One response was, well, everything. Another response was something to the effect of, well, you know, I'm just not sure that I have been doing the things that I need to be doing, and I'm not sure I want Jesus to find me like this. And another response, well, I'm not sure that everything is in as good an order as I'd like it to be. Believe it or not, that was not a housewife who was saying, the house isn't clean enough. As a pastor, what I can tell you is that there are times when I encounter people who have been good disciples for all of their lives, who are approaching the end of their life, and the whole community knows that they have been good and faithful people. And sometimes I'm sitting with them and they start to ask me questions and say, but Pastor, I'm just not sure that I've been good enough. And so whether it's that whole sense that, as a colleague of mine put it, everything frightens me because I know that when Jesus comes into my life, Jesus starts asking me to do things that I'm not always sure I want to do. Or whether it's a college student who's not so sure that that individual has been, well, showing up in all the right places. or whether it's a young professional who's just not sure that all the ducks are in a row, or whoever it is, whatever your answer is, there is that truth that as we look up and we see Jesus coming to us to be with us, there can often be that moment, maybe more than a moment, where we feel some anxiety. And with those disciples, those first disciples who have been with Jesus from the beginning, who have heard him announce that the reign of God has come near, who have seen him heal and cure people, who have seen him restore new life, who have seen him reconcile relationships and bring people back together, who have witnessed all the ways that Jesus has enacted God's love in their presence. And even they in that boat have a moment, it's a ghost. We too have those kinds of moments where Jesus coming to us sure seems frightening. But the truth is, like Peter, when we all of a sudden find ourselves looking around and recognizing the wind and the storm and the danger, and all of a sudden start to sink in ourselves, Jesus reaches out to us, takes our arm, and pulls us forth. And it's possible Jesus asks, "Why do you doubt?" The witness that we have, the promise that we have, the truth that we have is that God is about love. And that love is unconditional and it's big. And that God is about reconciliation and forgiveness. And we can't do anything to merit it or deserve it. But that God brings these gifts precisely because we need them. And that when Jesus comes to be with us, what Jesus is bringing is new life, along with that forgiveness and reconciliation and love. And so we can know that in the midst of that, even though we still have a reflexive moment of fear, that we can trust with every fiber of our being that when Jesus is coming to us, it is a gift of love, a gift of forgiveness and new life, a gift of reconciliation, a gift of relationship.